People will go through great lengths to save the life of someone that they love, travel across countries, pay thousands of dollars. Make a deal with the devil? That last one doesn't seem like such a stretch in some situations. In circumstances where the lines between science and superstition become blurred. In 1982, George Brown was a father so desperate he would desecrate the graves of his wife and daughters, burn a rotting human heart, and feed it to his son Edwin. Extreme and more than convoluted, but these events convinced George and his neighbors that they had saved a town from a vampire. In today's journey, we will be exploring the craze of the New England vampire panic and the bizarre events that led to the defilement of Mercy Lena Brown's resting place. Did modern medicine fail communities, or were the rumors of death-defying creatures based on some truth?
In modern pop culture, vampires are depicted as sexy, intelligent, and mysterious individuals that are a gateway to a luxurious and desirable lifestyle. We have shows like The Vampire Diaries and movies such as Nosferatu to thank for that depiction. This fantasy has evolved over the years. There was a time when such creatures were publicized as creepy, sickly stalkers lurking in the shadows, immortal beings who preyed on humans and can turn into bats or mist. A time where they were seen as harbingers of death. And while we think of vampires as fantasy, there was a time when people in New England believed vampires were real, and that they were responsible for spreading a deadly disease among family and neighbors. 200 years after the Salem witch trials, another terror surrounding the paranormal riveted the United States. In September of 1884, the St. Charles Herald published an article on the front page reporting vampire attacks that had been documented in Romania and other areas of the world. It was titled, "Vampires, the Horrible Superstition That Still Exists in Romania," and it was based on letters from a Bucharest correspondent. The article centered around ways to stop the assaults from happening, including morbid methods that were being used elsewhere in the world. Most commonly, this consisted of grave sites being dug up and using the bodies as proof that supernatural happenings were underfoot. One of the most common signs would be a deceased heart still full of blood. Family members would begin to secretly dig up graves of deceased loved ones, but soon concerns of superstitions were so heightened that grave exhumations became voted for by town fathers and clergymen. When a corpse was declared a vampire, several rituals would take place. Mostly, these consisted of rituals involving the hearts, but in some cases, they would include other organs. The hearts and bodies would be burned, stakes sometimes driven through the chest, and bodies beheaded. The article referred to many gypsy and Jewish practices, as well as a few other cultural vampiric lore, and has become a popular piece of pop culture referencing a time as New England was known as the New England Vampire Panic. Because of this, New England would then be dubbed as the vampire capital of America. Stories of vampires ran through small towns and villages, and one such story fell on the doorstep of George Brown after a series of tragic deaths plagued his family. George, born in 1840, and his wife Mary Eliza, born in 1841, married in 1862. They then moved to Exeter, Rhode Island, where they raised their children, Mary Olive, Edwin, Mercy Lena, Alice, Clara, and George Jr. During the early 1880s, both Mary and their eldest child, Mary Olive, became sick with a mysterious illness that left them both heavy in breath, coughing up blood, and their faces sunken and pale. Slowly, the women's health deteriorated, and on December 8th in 1883, Mary passed away at the age of 42. Mary Olive's death followed her shortly after, on June 6 in 1884. She was 20 years old. The women were buried at Chestnut Hill Cemetery. Sadly, the health of the rest of the family would be short-lived. Years later, both Mercy, Lena, and Edwin started to show symptoms of the same illness. Mary began to exhibit symptoms for the first time in 1891. Her health quickly fell, and soon after, Edwin became ill as well. They both exhibited similar symptoms as their mother and deceased sister: gauntness in the face, weight loss, and coughing blood. Edwin, 24, was newlywed and working as a store clerk. To attempt to heal himself, Edwin moved to Colorado Springs, believing that the fresh air and spring water would cure him as per doctor's orders. There were many stories of success from that area when it came to battling this ailment, and for a while it seemed to work. Edward had started to improve. But this too would be short-lived. Alas, battling his illness in Colorado for 18 months, he moved back home, essentially to die and be buried with his sister and mother. At this point, his sister Mercy had already succumbed to the illness, passing away at the age of 19 on January 17, 1892. She had been buried alongside Mary and Mary Olive. Some of the town folks of Exeter had heard of the Browns' tragedies and came to George's doorstep with an odd theory and an even more troubling solution. Clearly, their modern medicine was failing them, so the cause of this illness must have been something more supernatural. There were rumors that undead entities, or vampires, could infect the living relatives and neighbors to feed off of their life source and sustain itself. The result would appear as a disease. To the neighbors of the Browns, this must have been what it looked like was happening, and according to the rumors that fight back against the undead, certain rituals must be performed. The first step was to dig up the grave of those who had already previously passed. There were ways to tell if a corpse wasn't dead, if their bodies showed little decomposition, or if their hearts were still filled with liquid blood, then this was for sure a telltale sign of vampirism. Once identified, the heart must be removed, the creature beheaded, and a rearranging of its bones needed to take place. The neighbors posed this idea to George. George was of course reluctant. These methods were unorthodox to say the least, and the idea of desecrating the graves of his family didn't sit well with him. But at the same time, he was desperate to save Edwin, who was becoming more ill each day. The town doctor, Dr. Harold, strongly advised against this, believing in his medical teachings, and tried to moralize the folks of his scientific understanding of what was happening. He urged the town folks to think logically. Unconvinced, the neighbors won the argument and persuaded George to unearth Mary, Mary Olive, and Mercy Lena. 4 of the townspeople collected their shovels and picks and axes and went up to Chestnut Hill Cemetery where the women were buried to exhume their graves. They would be looking for signs that death was not yet complete. First, both Marys were exhumed. Their bodies showed the normal stages of decay. Clearly, they were not the vampires. This left Mercy. They unearthed the body of the young girl, and to their dismay, she had hardly decomposed at all. She had been laying in a crypt for some time before being buried, yet her skin looked remarkably well preserved, and it appeared as though her nails and hair had grown. They pricked her skin, and it drew blood. Cutting her open revealed her heart still contained blood. Dr. Harold stepped in once again, proclaiming this was all normal, but the town folks weren't convinced. This was all the evidence they needed. Mercy was the vampire. Now that the creature had been identified, The next steps were to destroy the vampire and cure Edwin of his illness. The townspeople removed Mercy's heart from her body and burned it to a charred crisp on some nearby stones. The charred remains were taken back to the Brown house, where they were used to create a tonic that was then force-fed to Edwin. The newspapers wrote an article on the event and published it on March 17th of that year. The people of Exeter were sure that this ritual would unquestionably stop the plague of death that had been following the family. Sadly, this remedy did nothing to help Edwin, and he passed on May 2nd, 1892. He was buried alongside his sisters and mother. However, no one else in the town became sick after this, further proving to the townfolk that this had in fact gotten rid of the horrid vampire. What was truly the cause of death of the Brown family? Was it a supernatural monster from beyond the grave, or were they simply sick? The answer is an illness called tuberculosis, or TB, and during the 19th century it was referred to as the wasting disease or consumption, since its symptoms presented in a way that made the infected look like they were wasting away. TB is a bacterial illness which mainly impacts the lungs, but it can affect other organs such as the spine or brain. It spreads through tiny droplets carried through the air when a person coughs or sneezes. Symptoms include fever, coughing, and difficulty breathing, coughing up blood, fatigue, weight loss, gauntness, which would make a person look like their eyes and cheeks were sunken in. During this time, TB was plaguing the entire country, and very little was known about the illness as medical advancements were not what they are today. A German doctor, philosopher, and chemist had a theory. Dr. George Stahl worked on the belief that an invisible life force called the animus kept the lungs and heart working and kept blood in liquid form. In other words, a soul. It was his belief that the animus could leave a deceased body through the blood and enter another body through the lungs. He based these beliefs off of his observations of how TB, which he called consumption, presented and spread. Noticing that usually whole families were infected, and how the infected would cough up blood, that the bodies were sometimes better preserved than others after death. For example, having fresh blood in the heart. He contributed this to the animus and believed that in some part, this was what spread the diseases like consumption. To stop the spread, he proposed a practice that he called therapeutic exhumation, a practice in which a body would be exhumed and checked for signs of disease, such as lack of decomposition and liquid blood still in the body, which according to him meant that the animus was present. To stop the animus from spreading illness, they would need to burn the heart or rearrange the bones. Stahl never intended this theory to boost vampiric lore, but rather explained how TB spread as an illness. Unfortunately, a combination of his fuzzy 19th century science and German and Eastern European superstitions added in the creation of the vampire. As a result, the ritual of therapeutic examination became intertwined with other rituals that included driving stakes through the chest, beheading the corpses, rearranging the bones, sometimes in a skull and crossbones pattern. Most cultures have a history dotted with vampiric lore, but most of the beliefs now in New England were based off of Eastern European traditions. While Eastern European traditions surrounded things like why a person becomes a vampire and the type of precautions a person could take to prevent becoming a vampire, New England's beliefs were more focused on the medical and healing aspects of vampirism. Many settlers in New England were from Scotland or Wales, but there were those who had ventured from Eastern European to escape the Revolutionary War. A lot of them would have been mercenaries hired by the British troops. The practice of exhuming the deceased was likely introduced to New England by traveling healers among these immigrants. While the idea of Stahl's therapeutic exhumation was brought over by German soldiers, these rituals first began sometime around 1784. Mercy was the last documented case of exhumation under suspicion of vampirism, but she wasn't the only one. There are over 80 cases of vampire rituals that have been currently documented in New England, and more cases are constantly being discovered. Going back in time 100 years earlier, the grave of Sarah Tillinghast was among the first. Sarah was also from Exeter and was buried in a small family cemetery that holds about 25 graves. While Mercy's story is quite sad, Sarah's seems far more sinister. Her father is a farmer named Stukely, and he has 14 children. One evening, he has a dream that a tree in his orchard dies and rots away. Not long after this, several trees do start to rot and die. Half the orchard is destroyed. Shortly after this, Sarah falls ill. Like the Browns' symptoms, she too is coughing up blood and wasting away, with her face gaunt and her eyes sunken. It isn't long before Sarah dies, but after that, another child falls sick. This daughter claims that at night Sarah visits her from beyond the grave, and each time, it causes her great pain in her chest. Soon this daughter dies as well, followed by 4 more children. Now Stukely's wife and son are ill and having visits from a ghostly Sarah. His son would point to his chest and claim, "Here, Sarah touched me here, it hurts." The farmer is now becoming desperate, and the townsfolk are suspicious. One farmhand has been telling a story from a neighboring town of the dead rising from the grave to torment families. In search of signs of the supernatural, they exhumed 6 of the deceased family members. Sarah's corpse was found to be extremely well preserved, despite having been the first to pass. Her heart was still full of blood. Her hair and nails appeared to have grown since being buried as well. The other 5 bodies, though, seemed to be decaying as one would have expected. This evidence, combined with the premonition-type dreams, was enough for the folks to perceive Sarah as a threat. They cut out her heart and burned it. While Stukely's wife recovered, his son was too sick and passed. But nobody else became ill or died. Proof that they were right about their suspicions all along. Some of the others include Rachel Harris, whose heart was burned in Woodstock, Vermont in 1790 after she died of consumption at the age of 37. There was Nancy Young, whose heart was burned in Manchester, Vermont in 1793 after she died of consumption at the age of 24. And Frederick Ransom, whose heart was burned in South Woodstock, Vermont, 1817. He died of consumption at the age of 20. Years after Mercy, a young man named Nellie Vaughn was believed to have been a vampire after death. Although his grave was never exhumed, it does bear a warning. Inscribed on his headstone reads, "I am waiting and watching for you." Rumor has it that nothing grows around his West Greenwich grave. These are just some examples of the New England vampire panic, but there are many more, and these events didn't just happen in New England. What would compel populations to be so strongly convinced of what we today would consider fictional nonsense? Today, we recognize that vampires are the stuff of legends, but there were plenty of misconceptions during the 19th century that would make for compelling evidence of the contrary. Wasting disease is a fitting description considering its symptoms. Patients quite literally wasted away, explaining the gauntness of the Brown's face and her sunken eyes. As this was an illness that attacks the lungs, patients often coughed up blood and experienced chest pains. This sounds like the Tillinghast case, a lot of these symptoms presented can be linked to how we describe modern vampires, including the sexy appeal vampires were supposed to have. Before heroin chic, there was TV chic, comparable to Tim Burton's Corpse Bride. Women who were paler with larger eyes were considered to be the beauty standard. The paleness and gaunt faces of TV created this look. Even coughing up blood would leave stains of blood around the mouth, a stark way of how we would identify vampires today. Now, we have an understanding of what tuberculosis is. We have treatments and even vaccines for it. But at the time of the vampire panic, not much was known about airborne illnesses such as TB. Doctors were still trying to understand it, and they didn't realize that it was a contagious bacteria that spread through the air, making larger families living under one roof and small, tight-knit communities more susceptible to the disease. To doctors, the best way to cure the illness was to move the patient to a different climate. As the lungs were affected, locations with drier, warmer climates were more desirable. Obviously, this didn't help, as such was the case with Edwin Brown moving to Colorado in hopes to be cured. All this did was spread the disease. Other remedies included breast milk from a pregnant woman or placing bits of seaweed under your pillow. But of course, these methods didn't help either. With a lack of understanding came growing desperation. Combined with a heavy dose of fear, neighborhoods began to lose faith in the medical leaders, and they started to come up with their own conclusions and remedies to the problem. It was clear to them that the cause of death wasn't medical in nature, but supernatural. To us, these methods seem utterly ridiculous. But to the people of the time, it was sound logic. So when placing seaweed under their pillows at night didn't help, of course, desperation made vampire rituals seem more reasonable to them. These conclusions were based off of real-life observations and making comparison to real-life situations. For example, opening a grave to find a corpse with blood in its mouth must have been an indication that the corpse was feeding on blood. The dead are not supposed to grow, so if their nails and hair appear to still be growing, person cannot be fully dead. We now understand that after a person dies, their hair and nails do not continue to grow. It's more of an illusion created from water leaving the body, and as such, skin clings tighter to the body. As it recedes, more of the nail bed shows, creating the appearance of growth. So how does science explain the state of Mercy's body when she was exhumed? How is it that her body hadn't decomposed? Some reports vary on this matter, but most agree that her body probably was stored in an above-ground crypt for several months after death. At the time of her passing, the ground was too frozen to break, so the town needed to wait for a thaw to dig a grave. It is surmisable that if the ground was frozen from winter weather, the cold would also have preserved her body. We understand now that with cold temperatures, decomposition can be prolonged. When you take into consideration the cold weather conditions and the fact that Mercy was the most recently deceased, having died that January, it only stands to reason that her body would have not been as decomposed as those of her mother and sister. While death surrounded them, George Brown and certain members of the Tillinghast family seemed to be untouched by the illness. But how is this possible? Like many other diseases, tuberculosis is a confusing illness. It presents very differently in every person it infects, and some people are asymptomatic, meaning that they present no symptoms at all. They become carriers of the illness, but they don't suffer from the life-threatening symptoms. There are some historians that believe Edgar Allan Poe was one such person. If Poe had a romantic interest in you or loved you at all, it was most likely a death sentence. Many of his female companions passed from TB, and yet he himself never formally contracted the illness. We understand that TB is spread through water droplets, making families under one roof easy targets for infection. So how is it that Mercy Lena didn't show any symptoms until years after her mother and sister were taken by the disease? Again, TB can present differently in everyone it affects. One way is referred to as galloping. This is where a person can be infected with TB but remain asymptomatic for many years. When symptoms do arise, the illness becomes aggressive and the infected rapidly declines much faster than those who presented symptoms shortly after becoming sick. While it was never documented, it is hypothesized that Mercy and Edwin both had the galloping forms of TB. There was more to telling if a person was a vampire than just their symptoms or their body. There were other convincing factors. Sometimes it was a person's grave site. People at that time had some sort of a sense that in a certain respect, death is contagious. And there were no witness accounts of a person physically leaving a grave or sucking blood. But if a vine was traveling across the ground or from one grave to another, this was an indication that another family member would soon die. The vine was seen as a transference of the illness or evil. And while it was not intended to back the idea of death as a contagious concept, Dr. Stahl's concept of the animus also played a role in how people of that time understood morality and the response to the idea of death itself. To many, death by itself is a scary concept. So is the idea of losing a loved one. But the vampire panic was more than just that. It was also about what happens after we die. Today, part of the appeal of being a vampire is getting to live forever, and being young and the beautiful aspect. But this was a society deeply rooted in strong Christian philosophies. The idea of an afterlife and heaven was forefront in how people conducted their day-to-day lives. To be undead and to live forever meant no heaven. The curse of being a vampire meant to never be with God. It also meant that you were soulless, which was a terrifying notion to the people of the 1800s. Their spiritual health, as well as their physical, was at risk, and this added to the desperation that people held. The craze of vampire rituals and belief eventually came to an end because of several things, primarily medical advances and scientific understanding. TB has existed for an estimated 9,000 years. There are archaeological finds that date back to the Neolithic period. But it wasn't until 10 years after Mercy's death, a German microbiologist discovered the bacteria responsible for the illness. While 10 years seems like a long time to pass before people stopped desecrating graves, there was certain scientific steps that needed to take place first, especially when there are lesser advancements than we are currently accustomed to today. Discovering the cause or source was only the beginning to the solution. The first medications that were found to be effective against TB weren't discovered until 1944. They included streptomycin and aminocylic acids, followed by what was referred to as triple therapy. This included 2 medications and then slowly introducing a third, followed by the first antibiotic treatment in 1949. Although the first vaccines against TB were used in 1921, that doesn't mean that this was an effective medication as the vaccines we know today. While advancements were made over the years, it wasn't until the 1980s that medical science even found a cure. Medical treatments alone were not responsible for quelling the fears of vampires. New burial practices helped as well. In the time of the 19th century, the practice of embalming wasn't widely used, nor was it as sophisticated as it is today. The dead were laid to rest in simple wood coffins. No fancy jewelry or elaborate clothing. The Civil War introduced embalming on a larger scale. Suddenly, there was a concern about preserving bodies for grieving families. In the countryside, the embalming brought peace of mind, that it could ensure a corpse was truly lifeless. After all, if blood was the life source for a soul, then to remove all the blood from a body and replace it with a chemical would mean that a corpse was truly lifeless. The 19th century was marked by technological innovations, social changes, and a political system increasingly focused on economic growth. Urban centers became hubs of commerce, education, and first ideas. Larger cities experienced a significant transformation due to rapid industrialization and urbanization. The inventions of new machinery and steam power led to the establishment of factories, which attracted large numbers of people from rural areas seeking employment. Previously sheltered from these typical social changes, many rural areas were still deeply rooted in superstition and folklore. But as people moved away from the countrysides to the city, they encountered education and exposure to new perceptions. Exposure to secular thinking reduced belief in the supernatural creatures that often thrived in rural areas with superstition. With these new thought processes, the idea of understanding the undead slowly diminished. Finally, the media and literature played a role in the demise of the New England vampire panic. While not the first literary representation of vampires, Bram Stoker's iconic novel Dracula, published in 1897, is arguably the most important work of vampire fiction. It was never confirmed, but there are those who believe that the story of Mercy Brown had some influence in the novel. Stoker's tale of a Transylvanian count with supernatural abilities who wreaks havoc in England inspired countless works thereafter. Dracula solidified many popular conceptions of vampirism that appealed to early cinematic portrayals. Stoker's Dracula introduced to us a charismatic yet terrifying figure, a vampire who could move seamlessly between shadows and society. His influence extended beyond literature. It shaped how vampires were portrayed on screen. The novel's success paved way for cinematic adaptations like Nosferatu and Bela Lugosi's iconic portrayal of Dracula himself. These films transformed vampires from fearsome, supernatural beings into literary and cinematic features that continue to captivate audiences today and erode away the folklore and superstition that thrived in rural communities. Despite changes in the world, vampire mythology remains prevalent in modern communities. They will forever be considered a classic Halloween costume, and in more recent years have had a resurgence in popularity. With novels such as Interview with the Vampire and Twilight, the idea of vampires has become more romanticized from the disease-spreading monstrosities of the 19th century. New Orleans hosts a vibrant vampire community, akin to the folklore where people live as vampires, feeding on donated blood. As we reflect on the tragedy of Mercy Lena Brown, one can't help but wonder what she would have thought of the vampire myths and how they've evolved since her grave was desecrated in 1892. No longer a mere symbol of fear and superstitions, vampires have become cultural icons, embodying our deepest desires and fears. They represent not only terror of death, but our fascination with the idea of eternal life. Mercy's story highlights the intense fear of death and the unknown that gripped societies of the past, leading them to desperate measures. Today, we might see vampires as glamorous or alluring, but at their core, they still remind us of our own morality and the mysteries that lie beyond. As you continue down the crooked path, let Mercy's story be a reminder of how far we've come in understanding the unknown, and how our fears and fascinations with death and eternal life continue to shape our stories and imagination. This is Amanda Joy signing off. Keep exploring, keep questioning, and let the mysteries guide your steps.